Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Goddles and Pat Cummings. George Floyd's tragic death in late 2020 sparked a significant shift in media coverage. While in June of that year, Fox News mentioned critical race theory only 3 times, a year later, during a 4-month period, they brought up CRT over 1,900 times. This sudden obsession turned CRT, an obscure academic framework, into a supposed threat to our schools with claims that children were being indoctrinated by woke leftist teachers. The affluent suburb of Southlake, Texas, also became engulfed in this frenzy, with conservative activist groups, GOP politicians, and right-wing media stoking the flames. They pitted neighbor against each other to the point that civility and respect were scarcely heard in the community. Let's discuss. Well, warm greetings. Well, I am excited, very excited to have Mike Hixenbaugh on today to talk about his wonderful new book, They Came for the Schools, One Town's Fight Over Race and Identity and the New Wars on American Classrooms. I looked at this book, Mike, you're #1 on local politics on Amazon. Did you know that?
Yeah, well, I will confess to taking a look at those numbers every now and then in the last couple of weeks. I'm glad to see the book is reaching people and resonating with people.
Oh, such a good book. And you have 2 companion podcasts. You have one called Southlake and then a follow-up, Grapevine. This is kind of interesting. You start your book comes out of the podcast. Is that correct?
Yeah, it really is. My colleague Antonia Hilton and I started reporting on what was happening in Southlake, this affluent suburban school district outside of Dallas, back in late 2020, early 2021, reporting on how, parents were resisting conservative far-right activists and conservative parents were resisting changes to try to improve the culture at the school district for Black kids and LGBTQ students. And so we ended up telling that story in a 6-part podcast series. And a lot of people asked that we then went on to make a second series about the town next door called Grapevine. And people have asked, you made 2 podcasts, a total of like 15 episodes, hours of content. Why did you write a book? And the answer is there was more to the story. The story's, first of all, still unfolding. And second, there was a lot of history that I felt like that was important to explain the context of what's happening in these communities and in America that you can't fit into a 6-episode podcast. And so, I've just kept going on it.
Good. You know, what I also liked about your book is you are a very good investigative news reporter. And you could read your whole podcast and book and not really know, well, you kind of get your opinion, but you just try to get the information. You try to embrace the people from one side and the other side equally. You're fair and engaging them. You're engaging them as a good reporter does, letting them know. And so that's I think another good point about your book is how well it follows good reporting.
A lot of what I do in this reporting on this subject has been to write down what people say in public and then put it into context. Right. And that last part is where, some of the people who are upset with my work get upset, is where I'll, point out if something that was said was factually wrong, or if I place it in historical context of, how these comments, school board meeting comments where parents are complaining about critical race theory or whatever, how that fits into a long history of reactionary movements in America. But yeah, I appreciate that. At one point, after I published an article on this subject that became part of the book, Steve Bannon went on his National War Room podcast and was reading part of the article on air. And I'll never forget, he said, as he was going, he was like, you know what? This is actually pretty accurate. And so I've been leading with that. I would love to maybe get it on a future book jacket, actually pretty
Good.
accurate, Steve Bannon.
Right.
But that's the truth, is like, we're really committed to telling a full and complete story and telling it truthfully. Now, that's not the same as, hear this kind of debate over both sides, both siderism in journalism. If someone is telling a lie, their perspective isn't necessarily, or that lie doesn't deserve equal weight
Right.
in a story. But to the degree that we're able to help people understand where these folks are coming from, what's motivating their beliefs, where they're getting their information from, I think that's all important and part of the story.
Well, the three of us know the background, but we need to do an
Sure.
elevator pitch about what's going on here. You are talking about a fluent suburb in north of Houston, and by fluent, it's the average income's $240,000 a year. Home prices are 1.2 million. This is Texas, so I don't know what
Sure.
those homes. When you see pictures of these homes,
Yes.
and where you're from on the East Coast and where I'm from in Seattle, they're $3-4 million homes. They're
Sure.
beautiful homes.
Right.
And the title of the book is They Came for the Schools. They have great schools there, great meaning, good college acceptance, good sports, good schools, high SAT scores. I mean, it is a type of district. If you just look at the statistics, the district is a good school. So fill us in. Tell
Yeah.
us the story about that.
Yeah. So the town is called Southlake. It is as you mentioned, a wealthy, elite suburban community, about 20 miles north of Fort Worth or Dallas. And um, anywhere where you live in the country, you know a version of this town. It's the place where your rich friend lives. It's the town that everyone maybe loves to hate if they don't live there, and if you do live there, you're really proud of it because you were able to afford this expensive house and to get your kids this elite education. And the reason that I wanted to focus the story there is because Southlake is in a lot of ways representative of suburbs all over the country. It's this place that was developed in the aftermath of Brown v. Board, the desegregation battles of the 1950s and 60s. And um, as a result of the way the city was developed, through zoning policies prohibiting multifamily housing, forcing people to build on a certain amount of land, the community is sort of white, or is wealthy by design. And in America, when wealth, especially in the 1960s and 70s, but still today, wealth is a proxy for race. And so by keeping the community wealthy, Southlake was largely white. That's America's suburbs. And as a result, the school district was well funded. All of the kids coming from wealthy households, so they did well in school. Not a lot of behavioral problems for the teachers to deal with. But like a lot of suburbs across the country, Southlake became more diverse beginning the last 20 or 30 years as Black parents and parents of other minority students sought out the same types of same type of American dream that white folks had been pursuing. And so they saw the good test scores in Southlake schools and other suburbs and moved out there. And that reality led to conflict that has been simmering just under the surface in communities like Southlake for 2 or 3 decades. It's what some Black parents began to call the hidden cost of admission of getting your kid a great education in a mostly white, affluent suburban school district like Southlake. Your kid was maybe the only Black kid in class, and as a result, some of his classmates would make stupid jokes, would casually use racial slurs like the N-word in class, would make comments like, "Hey, you're the smartest Black kid I know."
Right.
Um, and that's something that Black parents in particular, and parents of Black children, have known about. But in the era of Donald Trump, like a lot of things, these kind of hidden fault lines exploded to the surface. in Southlake and in other suburbs. And so when I pick up the story, beginning in 2020, the school district is trying to address some of those complaints of racism and that legacy, by putting together a plan to educate children, all children in Southlake, on how to be kind to each other, to teach them that America's history of racism and how and what it takes to confront those things. And that plan just happened to be released to the world in the midst of the pandemic, and just a few months after George Floyd was murdered, and we were seeing at first nationwide protests for racial justice by Black Lives Matter activists, and then a backlash to those protests. And so a lot of white conservatives in Southlake saw this plan, this DEI plan, as part of that, as part of what they were Donald Trump was warning was this attempt to remake America, to destroy America by teaching white children that America is racist and bad. And so rather than embrace the change or try to to negotiate a path forward, they went to war. They put together a political action committee called Southlake Families PAC and raised hundreds of thousands of dollars to take control of their school board. And this was really the seed that led to the war on woke, or the war on critical race theory, or the war on DEI that is now spread to communities all over the country.
And we've had many shows about that, about the importance of the George Floyd thing and how that added as a catalyst towards this conflict. I want to bring Greg into this, but I want to give you some background first. I sent my kids to a school district 10 miles from here that's a Southlake. It was predominantly white, great schools, great, it's just was a beautiful place. And I did that intentionally. Right across the Tacoma Narrows Bridge is Tacoma, which is much more diverse, 67% poverty, great diversity. And I ended up spending 20 years working in Tacoma and realized that I made a mistake, that Tacoma was a wonderful place, that the diversity was great. I was a Southlake parent. Greg, tell me, Greg, talk about you and your kids. Get some background. You were the opposite.
Yeah, when I was married, my wife and we thought in a different fashion. I was kind of struck by your opening when you described this woman who takes her Black children from Los Angeles looking for good schools. And I hear good schools, I cringe, because my experience has been that people that speak that language are the people that gave up on the public school system in one form or another, escaping to give their kids advantages. I never saw giving an advantage to my children as my goal in life. My goal in life was to give them a happy place to be, a place for them to be who they were going to be. And my job was to make them excel and find ways to do that. And I thought all school districts could do that. I came from a small Midwestern, kind of a rural school. I think our graduating class was 89, and we had a lot of diversity actually, but they weren't elite teachers or anything, but we did well. Some of us did very well. So our first thinking as parents was, we want to go into an integrated neighborhood.
Well, wait, stop.
Absolutely.
Stop right there. It's important to realize you married a African-American woman, and your children identify as Black.
Yeah, I have a stepdaughter who's not, as people like to say, biracial. We didn't use those terms. My daughters were Black because that's the reality of living in America. But our idea was there were 4 communities in Pittsburgh where I live that were considered integrated. We wanted to be in those communities where our children would not stand out that much, but would have a really rich education and have diversity in their lives and go to schools. And we always felt that bringing our children to the school gave that school district an advantage, because we thought a lot of our children. We thought our children made schools better. And I used to have this problem when I had a business. Suburbanites would come and interact with me, and they'd say, well, we wanted to live in the suburbs because we don't want to live in the city because of the school districts. And I said, well, the school district in the city suffer because you don't live in the city. You don't have your children in. You're a conscientious parent. You care. You will bring values into the public school system. So in essence, this whole upper middle class elite thing just hit me like a two before. I don't relate to it. I don't understand it. I understand. And I noticed that you quote a number of people who are like football players or baseball players that go into these white suburbs. They do exactly the same thing in the North Hills of Pittsburgh. All the black Steelers all live in the North Hills of Pittsburgh. I don't understand that. I don't understand. It's like bizarre to me that people have this ingrained attitude about getting the best school.
What do you think?
What's interesting
to their own children.
What's interesting is you described that opening scene with this mom, Amy Roll, was trying to find a good school for her kids, right? And I think the conventional wisdom by middle class and upper middle class people, especially white folks, but also parents of black children, has been a good school for my kids is the one that performs well on standardized tests, that has resources and wealth. And so that's been the magnet. And that's what I was trying to capture part of what I was trying to capture in the title is the reason these districts are contested spaces is because so many people are moving there for the schools, moving there with different ideas of what a school should be. But I think in this current moment, what's interesting is that opening anecdote where the mom is moving across the country and looking for this after 2 decades of seeing her kids through the school system where, they did achieve academically. They were afforded great opportunities. They're all off to nice colleges. She looks back on it now, knowing all that she knows, with something like regret that she made the choice that she made. And I think that there's always been people who viewed schools the way that you described, of looking for the environment and not wanting your kid to be, isolated and looking for a rich cultural experience. But I think there's a growing appreciation for that worldview by like people I've written about, people in Southlake who had that mindset of if my kid is going to excel and have the best life, they need to be in one of these school districts. And I think a lot of folks, especially upper middle class black parents in these communities, are rethinking that mindset in this time when things in some ways, in their opinion, has gotten worse. Rather than address these issues, the schools have now, in this era of anti-CRT, anti-DEI, have taken 5 steps backward in their view and are banning programs that were meant to try to make things more accommodating or welcoming for their kids. And so there's a whole new paradigm. And I think the challenge people face is it's hard to let go it's hard for many parents to let go of the idea that, at the state of like many large urban school districts is all of the white people and a lot of the wealth has left. I lived in Houston, and HISD is overwhelmingly black, and the white folks who do live in Houston, many of them, if not most, send their kids off to private schools. And so parents are wrestling with, well, do I just send my kid to these underfunded programs that are stretched thin with dealing with this concentration of poverty, or do I look for a house out in Katy, out in the suburb? And it's I think difficult for parents to make the same choice, to reach the point that you reached and to make that decision. It's a challenge, I think.
I think, to be fair, I don't want to present people that differ with me as though they're bad people. I think they're victims. I mean, I think that, and you in your book, you talk of this, which I really appreciated. Even the Bradley Milliken decision, which you correct, I've written about it a great deal, but most people don't even think about it or know about it. But they're victims in the sense that white flight was created. It was a creation of developers. I mean, they really created a hysteria around urban areas. And so these ideas were implanted. They were not just homegrown. So I don't blame the people that have them. I get angry when I hear them talk, but I don't blame them. They're victims of a whole pressure system that led them into the suburbs. The suburbs are there because of racism. And now the exurbs are there because of, as you say, more blacks are in the suburbs. So now there's the exurbs. You can get further away from black people. But that was implanted in people's minds, and it's a great tragedy that the victimizers are never called out. The developers who benefited so greatly from these kind of things by creating this magic about school. In Pittsburgh, more Rhodes Scholars come from Alderdice High School in the city than any suburban school district, but you could never convince people who are living in the suburbs for better schools of that fact, because they've been seduced.
Yeah, it really hit home because I'm Southlake and I'm just ashamed. And
no need to be ashamed.
Well, we all make choices.
and
We all
in
make
a way,
choices.
I love the way
the best
you,
choices we can, right?
right.
Yeah.
And I love the way, Mike, how when you were talking about this mother who had her like very successful kids, and she just was so proud of her community and proud that they were in a nice home, and her kids came home and they said, we don't want to live here. This place is a toxic mess. And because she was in that environment, she didn't understand it as it was happening, in a way her children were protecting her. And that's the difference between Greg, because when Greg is in a school that's much more diverse, he can have these conversations. He doesn't have to wait for the kids to come back from college to tell him what was going on. He was parented them through that. Am I correct, Greg?
Yeah, no credit to me. It was just a different kind of environment where you were more involved and engaged, and you were aware of race, and you knew it was always lurking there. I had a 5th grade teacher that tried to convince me that my youngest daughter was learning disabled. I had all her California Achievement Test scores to the 5th grade, and they're all in the 99 percentile. And because the child was black, she was convinced that she was a liberal white woman as a teacher. She was convinced that she had a learning disability. That was a crippling thing for her as a teacher, but it wasn't going to be a crippling thing for me as a father, because I had the California Achievement Test scores, and I wanted to know why they dropped precipitously when in the 5th grade. Right. And it kind of took her aback, but we got on with things. But it was stunning. And yeah, you got to be engaged, and parents are, but they can't dream these things don't exist. Black parents can't dream that there's no racism in the suburbs. Right.
Yeah, part of what was happening in Southlake for these families was, these black parents who moved to Southlake. Often they had grown up in almost all black communities in the city, and they felt like they were, getting something better for their kids. And so their kids coming into these schools, and the culture that they kind of were born into, they didn't know any different. For a lot of them, they had to go to college into a more diverse setting where they realized, oh wait, I don't have to live in this world where my friends talk about my skin color all day, or make stupid jokes, or quote racist slurs at me. And that's part of what was happening all across the country in 2018, 2019, as Trump kind of opened a lot of people's eyes to what was happening in the country, what had been happening in the country. And those families started to reevaluate, wait a second, what is this culture my kid's been going to school with all this time? And yeah, that's what schools like Southlake started to try to address.
I like the way in your describing this. And I guess as you were doing the podcast, you were living it from event to event, correct?
I was at the time living in a suburb outside of Houston that it wasn't quite as elite as Southlake, but a similar story. It's a similar story in terms of it was pretty white, was growing more diverse. People would move there for the schools. And I was watching in my little cul-de-sac in my my little subdivision how, these national political fights over Black Lives Matter and, these claims that Antifa were coming to destroy the suburbs, that was really playing out in my neighborhood, on the neighborhood Facebook page, and in the signs people were posting in their yards. And so that, yeah, like the the local politics in America are national politics
Right.
now, and the the main downside to that is it turns neighbor relationships really ugly real fast.
So as I was looking at the diversity play, but basically there was an incident at Southlake where kids being kids were singing some rap song and they were using the N-word and probably just being idiots. And I people who are young adolescents are at times a little impulsive and not very sensitive. And that video ended up going viral, 3 million views. I mean, my goodness, that's so the school district did a really good job of saying, wait a second, let's deal with this. We realize we have a different environment here. Maybe we should have a diversity plan and talk about these things. That happens in districts all over, and they tend to be relatively successful. But you hit George Floyd, and you have Fox News mentioning critical race theory the month George Floyd was died. I think it was 109 times, and within a year, the last 4 months of that year, it was 1,900 times. So the conservative, what would you call it? The conservative agenda or whatever gets involved with DeSantis and West and Abbott and Fox News and Tucker and Gingrich and so forth. And they turn this diversity plan into a critical race theory proxy for everything that's wrong. And boy, did they do a good job, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the fight in Southlake initially was to some degree local actors, local parents who were outraged. Now, it seemed it's what's important to know is that they were seeing the plan in the context of the backlash against Black Lives Matter and the racial justice protests. And they put together this political action committee and raised a lot of money to take control of their school board because of those fears. And then what happened is when Southlake, the conservative folks won their school board. And Mike Antonia Hilton and I had done some reporting on that. It probably helped bring some national attention to what was going on there. Well, folks on Fox News like Laura Ingraham and Tucker Carlson went crazy for it. And so after the Southlake Families PAC won control of their school board on this anti-CRT, anti-DEI campaign, Laura Ingraham led her Fox News program with it, saying, probably the only time that Fox News has opened a primetime program with a local school board, the result of a local school board election. But her message was really like, here's hope. Our side is prevailing. This is like, 6 months after Donald Trump had lost in 2020. And here was the seed of hope that, we can win in these suburbs that were, suburban white voters who had supported Trump in 2016 maybe had turned against him in 2020. But here's an issue. Folks like Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon pointed to this as, here's our chance to win back the suburbs. And so what happened was the entire national conservative movement, from the media to the Republican Party to fringe groups, reoriented themselves around this issue. And this is how the rise of Ron DeSantis and Moms for Liberty. And when you went to CPAC that year, it was all about fighting woke in the schools,
Right.
defeating critical race theory, defeating the LGBTQ agenda, getting these pornographic quote unquote library books out of the schools. There was really an attempt to try to, the hope, as Steve Bannon put it, was they were going to save America by taking control of the school boards. And what they really meant was, we're going to win back those suburban voters, take control of those school boards, yes, but in the process, we'll win seats up the ticket, we'll win state legislatures, we'll win congressional seats, and we'll get Trump back in the White House. And so as a result, you saw Southlake Families PAC style political action committees spring up in suburbs, probably in most metro areas in the country saw some version of this in their suburbs. And again, like I said, local politics became national politics and vice versa.
Yeah, and I made a mistake. I said George Floyd was killed in May of 2020. That month, Fox News mentioned critical race theory 3 times, not 100, 3 times.
Yeah.
And the fellow who's most responsible, I think, in elevating this so successfully to a political wedge is Christopher Rufo, who happens to be
Right.
living in the district that I mentioned that I sent my kids to.
Oh, right.
And Christopher Rufo is very, very, I think, honest and effective in saying we are using critical race theory as this proxy boogeyman for all that's wrong with the schools. And and they did. To this day, it's considered teachers. That people think that teachers are just sitting there talking about critical race theory all day, indoctrinating their kids. It's just bizarre, absolutely bizarre. I don't know.
You're right. He was very honest. He talked about how his goal with introducing the idea of critical race theory as this thing that was being forced into all the schools, when he went on Tucker Carlson's Fox News program to introduce the nation into this concept. He said later that his goal was to turn critical race theory into a brand, something, a singular phrase that conservatives could attack and point to anytime they saw something that made them uncomfortable with how society was addressing race. And the other thing he did was kind of find extreme case examples and then make caricatures out of any effort to try to take a look at America's racist past, to try to teach kids how to be culturally sensitive and kind. It became this caricature where any attempt to address diversity and inclusion was painted as critical race theory, which in his definition meant we teach all white kids to hate themselves, we teach all Black kids that they're victims, and we teach all children to hate America. And you can't find, especially in Southlake, Texas, you can't find any programs that are doing those things. But that's what you hear from parents and over again who've watched these programs, who've watched Fox News, who've read these articles. That's the warning is, and many of them believe it, that you can hear the emotion in their voice. What do you mean you're going to teach my kid that he's a racist, and that he should hate this country? And it was very effective at stirring a lot of fear and motivating people to get really involved in these, ugly school board campaigns.
There's 3 things. You have this great wealth, and as like Greg was saying about the suburbs are created. They basically are created as a reaction to white flight.
They are white flight. They are white flight.
Yeah, and then you have this Christian nationalism, and the Seven Mountain ideology, and that is inextricably being hijacked also as a way of gaining power and control politically. Tell me about we're not talking about the second podcast, but your Grapeview podcast, where you talk about this. What's the mobile company? The
Patriot Mobile.
Patriot Mobile, which is just a conservative group of people that run a cell phone company, decided to pour money into a PAC to flip school board.
Yep.
Talk about that.
One of the things I document in the book is, this initial backlash against what was being called critical race theory. A lot of other groups in the American conservative movement that long predate this backlash, that have long advocated for other goals, saw what was happening in schools, the backlash against the pandemic safety measures, backlash against CRT, backlash against LGBTQ books. They saw an opportunity. And so what you had was groups that on the Christian right that have long advocated for a return to somewhat mythical era in which America was an explicitly Christian nation where kids were allowed to pray in school, made to pray in school and read the Bible. The groups have been pushing for that version of America in education for decades, largely on the fringes. But as this backlash was coming on, those people saw, here's our chance. And so what you saw in these communities and especially in state legislatures in the red states was a sudden push to say public schools are woke. They're turning your kids gay or trans, and the solution to that is to invite God back in. And so you're seeing a push to restore prayer, to hang the 10 Commandments in every classroom, to bring Christian chaplains into public schools, and then most crucially to give parents state funding, to school vouchers, to take their state money and spend that instead on either homeschooling or private Christian education. And so Patriot Mobile is a symptom of that bigger push. It's this Christian nationalist cell phone company, and yeah, they spent
kind of a Hobby Lobby type thing.
Yeah, on a smaller scale. And they spent
scale.
hundreds of thousands of dollars to take control of school boards in North Texas and started implementing those kinds of policies, pushing LGBTQ inclusion out and really calling for, hanging "In God We Trust" signs in all the schools. And that's the fight I think that you're really going to see heading into, into the election this year and going forward. Is there's a real big push to chip away at church-state separation, particularly, it's dovetails with the fight over abortion rights, IVF, the access to IVF treatments, and then how we educate our kids. And so I think you're going to see attempts to draw more lawsuits, and fights over these issues, because folks on the Christian right think they have a chance to really flip some old Supreme Court precedents.
Greg,
I
you're
think,
a good historian. Is this
it's-
just Scope's monkey trial version 2? I mean, is there any,
Well, look, I mean, public education, I think, has always been a battleground. I think right now only one side is fighting it, and that's the tragedy. People have grown complacent. I mean, you go back through the history of public education, every step of the way has been a fight to not send funds to private schools, subsidize private schools or parochial schools. The battle in the 50s, getting rid of red teachers and red books or not so pink books, whatever. I mean, it's always been a war for public education, and I think it always will be. But you got to have both sides fighting, and I think the right has been mobilized, and they're, as you say, someone's throwing hundreds of thousands of dollars into the struggle. What's going on the other side? I mean, how do you fight this? It's a fight for the middle. It's a fight for people that aren't engaged, aren't involved. They're just going to work every day. It's a fight over where they're going to stand. But you got to have both sides fighting. You can't rely upon academics. I think so much of the educational wars have been fought by academic recommendations. Books have been written about this. This is how things should be done. And it's left to stand. No one fights for them. I mean, you don't mobilize the public to make a fight for these issues. So I don't know, where do things stand exactly now? I mean, where are things in Southlake?
Southlake is all 7 school board seats are now in control of the Southlake Families PAC aligned candidates. Now, I will say this:
All 7?
Southlake, all 7. Southlake is a school district where, is a community where Donald Trump won with nearly a 30-point margin in 2020. And so what we've seen nationally is this idea that Steve Bannon had, that we're going to retake the suburbs through these issues. It hasn't really panned out. What's happened instead is the same divisions that divide our national politics are now being kind of superimposed onto local nonpartisan school board races. And although in 2021 and 2022, what you just described, where there was a asymmetric, just the Christian right was fighting the fight. In the last year and a half, there's been a good bit of organizing in communities, including in Southlake, but in suburbs like it all over the country. And what we've seen in community after community, if the district is more purple or left leaning than Southlake, where Joe Biden maybe was at least a little bit competitive in 2020, Moms for Liberty's losing those school board races left and right. And in its place, there's been a growing coalition of progressives and, just kind of moderate anti-Trump conservatives, kind of Mitt Romney Republicans, who are saying, well, I don't want this, and are kind of linking arms and forming their own political action committees with progressive community members. The example I point to in the book, in this community outside of Austin, Texas, Austin's blue, but the suburbs are like most suburbs, conservative or moderately conservative. This community of Round Rock, Texas, had one of these battles, and they had a Southlake Families PAC copycat PAC that was going to take control of the school board on this slogan of teach ABCs and 1, 2, 3s, not CRTs, LGBTs, kind of a sing-songy rhyme. Well, the other side got organized. Again, moderate conservatives and progressives got their own PAC. They raised some money, not as much as the folks on the right. And their slogan was make school boards boring again. And that resonated. They won by double digits in this kind of, coin flip type district. And I think I've seen that repeated in lots of places where these ideas, banning DEI, like really going after library books, banning, not letting teachers have a book that shows two dads holding hands or whatever. They're not broadly popular. It's not just a left versus right issue. It's kind of the divide is really between far right MAGA aligned Republicans and everyone else. And so there has been a shift. I've seen a shift.
Didn't you write that there were 1,000 people that showed up for a Black Lives Matter rally in South?
Yeah.
I mean, that's something to build upon. That's huge.
Yeah.
That was all over America.
The thing in Southlake is interesting is, it's there's a very motivated, impassioned 30 to 35% of the community that, and that's, that's the 1,000 people you see coming out to that rally, but they haven't been able to overcome just that margin that's in their community. And what's interesting and of note is now the federal government has stepped in. The education department.
That's right. Seven violations, civil rights violations. Is that right?
Right. Well, they had 8 investigations, and so far they've come back on 4 of them. The other 4 are still, kind of in process, but to basically have concluded that students' civil rights were violated in Southlake schools on the basis of race, gender, and sexual orientation. And now the federal government, the education department, who's charged with, enforcing some of these kind of foundational civil rights protections from the 1960s and 70s that say every student in America is guaranteed access to an education free of discrimination, regardless of their race or sex. The Biden administration has expanded that to include gender and sexual orientation. And what normally happens when the education department comes in and makes this declaration is the school districts have some time to negotiate, but ultimately they end up usually implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion training programs or strengthening the non-discrimination statement, all of the kinds of things that Southlake local voters have rejected. And this is setting up a test of, will the federal government hold strong on this? Will Southlake, the school board there, fight this? And then looking forward beyond that, what happens in November? Because Donald Trump has promised, and Project 2025 includes and spells out a plan for ending the federal education department, or at least taking away its ability to enforce these civil rights laws administratively. Donald Trump has talked about taking these kind of school policy and school civil rights. We'll send that back to the states. Let the states handle that like we used to. Kind of the same mantra from abortion, and I think that's consequential. If will communities like Southlake be made to implement these programs, or will will Donald Trump step in and tell them, keep doing your thing?
Yeah, and then you have on top of that the tremendous number of Republican states that are wanting to completely allow a transfer of taxpayer dollars to religious schools,
Right.
And then the targeting LBG gay teachers, so forth. I have a good teacher retiring this year, but 2 years ago I met him at a store. I said, "How's it going?" And he said, "It is the worst year I've ever had teaching, period." And he's identical to the teacher that you mentioned in Grapeview. Just a remarkable teacher, high demands, loves his kids, knows all of their names, so forth. But it was just having parents coming into his classroom. What are you teaching? How come my kid had this assignment? Why did you assign this book? He was just so frustrated because the administrators didn't know how to handle this. They didn't want to piss off all these parents, but they didn't necessarily have his back. And he says it was a horrible year. And that was kind of generally that's what your Grapeview story is. Yep. Of people going after teachers, right?
What's striking about that is, for the book, again, I wanted to set this all in historical context. In some ways, this doesn't match the world that I was born into in the 1980s and that I grew up in. Mm-hmm. Not that, there hasn't been harassment of gay educators especially in the 90s, 2000s. I grew up hearing anti-LGBTQ slurs all the time, and probably said some when I was a small kid without knowing better. However, it was generally accepted that they could teach in schools. And I've been, in the book I mentioned, and I've been reading and studying quite a bit about the movements in the 1960s and 70s by folks like Anita Bryant and the Briggs Initiative in California to drive to paint all gay educators, teachers, as pedophiles, predators, and to drive them out of schools legislatively. And we're seeing that replay so far on a smaller scale, but I think there's a risk of this pressure campaign, the thing that the teacher you mentioned talked about. Some parents are going further than just asking, what are you teaching? They're sending notes saying, you're a groomer, you're a child predator.
Right.
You have these books on your shelf, and I'm going to call the police. And it's driving teachers out of classrooms. Teachers who are there, one, because they have a passion for this. They're not getting rich, but they have a passion for teaching their kids whatever subject it is they teach. But a lot of teachers also, especially if they grew up in a more hostile environment, have committed themselves to making their classrooms a place where kids of any sexual orientation or gender can thrive.
Right.
Making them, safe for them. And those are the teachers most likely to be pushed out as a result of this really ugly, vile politics.
Greg, who was, you mentioned before the podcast that your teacher probably very responsible for shaping your career, and was a gay teacher.
Well, I think he was gay in the 60s. People didn't come out, but in high school, I was a kind of a science geek and into space travel and rocketry. And I had an English teacher named Hartley, Mr. Hartley. I didn't know his first name because we called our teachers Mr. or Mrs. But Mr. Hartley was probably gay. I mean, looking back on it, but he inspired me. He got me interested in humanities, into reading, into literature, into philosophy and things like that. And I never forgot him. And my aunt who raised me, who wasn't particularly socially liberal, knew I thought a lot of him. And when he passed away, he left Georgetown High School sometime after I left. We had a a situation where there were people that wanted to get rid of him, but
Hmm.
they weren't strong enough, and we had a stasis there. But eventually he left and he died somewhere, and she had a clipping. She saved for me because she knew he was important in my life and the way I was educated. So, but yeah, I mean, it's a war. It's just always a war. We have to fight for the kind of education we want. And it's hard to impart that to people, that you really have to fight for what you want. It's
Right.
not given. You can't run away and find a school district that's going to be, what is it, woebegone, Lake Woebegone? It's not there. It doesn't exist. So you have to be ready to fight for what's best for your children.
Mike, man, I don't know what to say, but you just did a great job with this. I'd recommend people read the book first, but if not, at least start with your podcast. And at the end of your second podcast, Grapeview, you have the first chapter for free of this book on
Right.
audio. What's next for you? Are you still on this beat? Are you still working with, who's your colleague that was so good? The woman.
Antonia Hilton.
Yeah, are
Yeah,
you still
Antonia
teaming
Hilton.
up with her?
We're continuing to some degree to report on these stories and increasingly interested in, beyond the public school system's, ways in which this kind of growing embrace of Christian nationalist
Right.
thinking is shaping our society and our politics. And so those are issues we're continuing to cover. We've written about how that's, stirring up controversy in public libraries and really, in some cases, radicalizing supporters of Donald Trump. And I think it's going to be a major story
It is. You're right.
that's going to be with us for a while.
Well, thank you.
Thank you both.
Keep
This has
up
been
the
great.
good work.
Thanks, Mike.
Really, I'm perseverating now, but just really enjoyed the book, and I'm looking forward to following your career. You're doing really good work. Bye
This has
now.
been
Thanks very
great.
much,
Thank you
Mike.
both.
Really appreciate
Awesome.
it.